A lot of companies are doing it right, but many of the big companies just are really stuck in doing things the traditional way because there's benefits. You just heard that government workers are being forced to come into the office. Is it really necessary? I work with a CEO who has employees in multiple offices in multiple cities. Is he in every single office on every single day? No. Inclusion is something that people expect, something that really helps support talent. And so I tell CHROs, how do you say you're inclusive without saying you're inclusive?
You've held several C-level and leadership roles and advised numerous startups with neurodiversity. And you mentioned how the numbers can be a little bit, or the percentage can be a little bit misleading. It could be as high as half. I mean, it almost seems like neurotypical is actually the neurodivergent kind of section at that point. But for people that may not know, are you able to share what it feels like in this leadership position, having neurodivergent traits that maybe many in the audience connect with and realize, oh, maybe I am like have some neurodivergent traits myself?
That was a lot in one question. So, the reason I'm pausing is because I feel like a lot of people have neurodivergent traits. And so, if you're asking, how do I get diagnosed for neurodivergent traits? How do I get assessed? There's a tremendous amount of assessment tools out there. I'm not going to personally assess people, but I try to think about traits in three buckets. You have the sensory traits. So, if you imagine look at the seven senses. Some of them you might be extra sensitive to. Some of them you might have a weak sensitivity to. So I would look at that. And then what is your response to a sense being stressed? So, in a lot of autism research talks about repetitive behaviors and tics, and a lot of that is in response to being overly stimulated sensorily. Then there's the cognitive traits. So, some of the strongest traits that I see show up at work is neurodivergent people tend to have a strong sense of justice. There's challenges with planning, organization, prioritization. There's something some people call it time blindness. I prefer to call it clock blindness, where you might have a different sense of passing of time than other people. So you could get locked into an activity. You could maybe hyper focus on something. Executives and companies spend a lot of money and time on different types of focus activities and meditation. One of the gifts that many people with ADHD have is when they get into a flow state, they could just be locked in a flow state. They could forget to eat, drink, socialize. They could just create magic. Let's see. So there's a number of memory challenges and benefits that people have. So I know a number of people with ADHD traits that have incredible long-term memory. A number of people with autism traits that have incredible short-term memory. Um, and then the third bucket of traits that I would talk about would be more around social traits. So there's the awareness of others' feelings, and there's the awareness of your own feelings. And so you might have a strong or a weak version of either. So, for example, my nonverbal literacy is very weak. I really pay attention to the words that people say. And unless I'm really tuning my radar to watch for people's body language, I'm not going to pick up on body language. So, understanding that, I could tell my team that, hey, if you need me to read body language, if you communicate more with your body language, let me know, and I'll have to turn that tool on. I have to activate that sense. Um, there are some people who talk about impulsivity or inhibition, and so if you feel like you're, and I would say this shows up a lot in management, where if you are prone to impulsivity, that might work in certain situations. But as a leader, if you see something and you start chasing that shiny object, and then you see someone else and start chasing the other shiny object, your team is going to start to really question your ability as a leader. And so when I'm coaching leaders, I have to understand, okay, is impulsivity a trait? And if so, how do we manage it so that it doesn't impact the rest of your team? Can you get ahead of it and tell your team, hey, by the way, this is one of my traits that I'm working on and I'm trying to manage it? And that way everyone's on board and everyone can calibrate to how you work and how they work.
Are there any other mindset shifts that you would highlight that a leader can implement, or a practical tool that you'd recommend in order to start creating more inclusive and dynamic workplaces?
I would say really it goes back to asking questions and just being curious. So, for example, there's this debate that people have around, should I use people first versus identity first? What that means is, let's say that you have a diagnosis for dyslexia. Am I a person with dyslexic traits, or am I a dyslexic? So one of them is saying, I'm going to take my diagnosis and turn it into my identity. And I'm doing that because it's very important. It's a very important aspect of who I am and how I move through the world. The other is saying it's just one small part of me. And some people feel like they should be called one way or the other. You never know what people prefer. You can read all the industry reports, and certain associations would say that we prefer identity first. At the end of the day, just ask people, hey, what do you prefer? What's the language that you prefer? There's a term that has been sunsetted in much of the research called Asperger's. It's a very problematic term for different reasons. I could get into that later if there is interest. But the DSM-4 or the DSM-5 discontinued that term. Yet some people still refer to themselves as being Aspie. I'm an Aspie. I have Aspie tendencies, whatever it is. They feel a sense of security in that label, even though a lot of researchers and psychologists and psychiatrists would say we don't use that term anymore. If a person wants to use that term, you as a manager shouldn't be the one to say, hey, you can't use that term.
What I love about all of this, again, it applies to everybody with any trait, is that there's transparency, there's communication, there's honesty, there's clarity in how we expect to navigate work together, which I think is a really useful thing for everybody. I would be interested to dig further into the Asperger's side of things. You're saying you could go deeper into it.
Sure. So going back into history, there was this guy, Leo Kanner in the United States and Hans Asperger in Germany, and they were both doing research on this thing that ended up becoming autism. Hans Asperger basically saw a lot of these people who were given these initial diagnoses as people during the, the Nazi regime as being sent to camps. And he said, hey, some of these people might have extraordinary abilities in cracking codes and helping us win the war. So let's give them a different diagnosis. Let's call them Asperger's. And Hans basically allowed for a lot of these people to survive persecution under the Nazi regime. That said, over time, people would say, oh, I'm high level, or I'm high functioning autistic, or I'm an Asperger person. And they would do that at the exclusion of other people on the autism spectrum. When you think about the autism spectrum, it's not linear. It's really a circular spectrum. And you might have high traits here, you might have low there. And so the more that we've done research on autism, the more that we realize that there's no such thing as high functioning, which was this idea that Hans Asperger pushed forward. There's just people who are incredibly intelligent, valuable, participating on high functioning teams that are nonverbal, that Hans would have probably dismissed as being low functioning because they didn't have the verbal skills. And so as we started to embrace more and more people, we started to learn more and actually improve the technology to allow people to participate in the workplace, we're starting to see that, oh, there's all these people that we kind of wrote off as being non-employable that are actually incredibly valuable.
Could you share one of the biggest challenges you've faced when trying to shift workplace cultures toward neuroinclusion and how you overcame it?
Yeah, I would say that for the bigger companies, they have an idea. They have a ERG that's focused on neuroinclusion, and a lot of the energy is spent on expensive, flashy things. So a partnership with this organization so that they can put out the LinkedIn post, and they're missing some of the more fundamental things, which are flexibility of when and where you work. And so when I'm talking to big corporations, that's where I spend a lot of my energy. If you're doing all these other things, but you don't offer people flexibility of when and where they work, then that's going to be a challenge. So for example, let's look at the when I work. If I'm being told to come in at 9 o'clock in the morning and leave at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, everyone's coming in at the same time. Everyone's taking similar transit routes. Maybe they're stuck in traffic in the car or on the same train. They're in these very noisy environments. They come into the office. Maybe they all take the same lunch shift. And you're having these events that are very intense on the sensory basis. And so is that stressing your employees? Is that allowing them to do the best work? If you have a staggered shift, maybe they come in at 10 or 11 o'clock. Maybe they come in earlier, so they miss some of that morning rush. What is it that the company really needs? Do you need people to be in the office between 10 and 12? Because if so, then just say, hey, everyone needs to be in the office between 10 and 12. Show up whenever, leave whenever, but 10 to 12, you need to be in the office. That's a much different conversation than saying everyone needs to be in the office between 9 and 5. So Flexibility of time is one. Flexibility of place is also one that we talk quite a bit about, but it's also very challenging. So I mentioned commutes can be very challenging. Working from home allows for people to show up at work on their little terminal and not be completely drained from that commute. There's a number of things, a number of research that was done during the early days of the quarantine that said that people were a lot more productive working from home than coming to the office. And that's been a challenge because as companies overhired, they're using work from home as a way to curtail some of those overhires, to lay people off. So you just heard yesterday that government workers are being forced to come into the office. Is it really necessary? I work with a CEO who has employees in multiple offices in multiple cities. Is he in every single office on every single day? No. Is he in an office every single day? No. He might be visiting a customer. He might be at home with a sick child. He might, even if he does his best to spend 50% of the time in one office and 50% in the other, he's not really in the office. And so when I asked him, why do you want people to be in the office? The answer came up really around his inability to understand what's going on in the workplace. And so if that is the problem, if we look at, okay, my problem is I don't understand what's going on. And by being in the office, potential solution, I'm able to redirect people. Let's go back to the problem. What else are potential solutions? Are there reporting structures? Could we redo some of our KPIs or OKRs? Could we understand how people are communicating so that you could get the same information without mandating that people show up in office? Because this person was losing people. He had an office in one city in Texas and he had employees in another city in Texas, and those employees didn't want to move and they ended up finding other jobs. He had employees in Boston who didn't want to move to New York City. So it was very much a challenge for him. And he was losing the war on talent because he was mandating this, because he might have understood the problem, but jumped to a solution that wasn't serving him.
As we wrap up, Shaun, I just want to take this moment to thank you for sharing with us a lot of your wisdom and insights. You had an incredible career and added a lot of definition to things that we might not have seen otherwise. Your website, braintypes.org, people can go to, sign up for your newsletter, see a little bit more about what you're doing and how you're doing it. Is there anywhere else you'd like to direct people to follow your work?
I think that's totally adequate. Braintypes.org is where a lot of this information is. I've been posting a lot of stuff on LinkedIn under my profile, Shaun Arora, ShaunArora. So some of the stuff that is more nuanced, I've been putting there. And I am working on a book right now called Work Traits that would really focus on some of these traits that we talked about today. Where else? I think that's probably it. I've been doing a number of corporate workshops for different companies. So if there is an interest in anyone out there who's listening to this, I'm happy to put together a team, put together a proposal to really help companies. I'm working right now with a law firm. I'm working with another company on different types of ways to create a more inclusive environment for the other company is a school. And so how do you help teachers create a more inviting space, a more inclusive space for their students? The law firm is an interesting case because lawyers have to work all sorts of wild hours for the clients. And for someone who, I know you're trying to wrap this up, but for someone who is medicating their ADHD with a stimulant, if you're expected to perform at the same level at 10 a.m. as you are at 10 p.m., you might feel pressure to take a stimulant before you're performing at 10 p.m. or 10 a.m., which stimulants have a certain decay. And so then that might negatively impact your sleep. And so how are you managing that as a law firm? And how are you creating better expectations for performance and work hours? So yeah, sorry, that was a little tangent, but I love figuring out these type of challenges for companies and helping to create more inclusive environments. And a lot of this just comes down to talking to people. You don't need to hire me. If you talk to your employees and you figure this out, I'm happy to facilitate a conversation and get things going. But my hope in the future is that I don't have to be hired, that we just have conversations about traits and we look at people not as being neurotypical and neurodivergent, but just everybody has certain traits. Like you were saying, Becky, how do we better understand and how do we better work together with our different traits?
Pleasure, Shaun. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Thank you.